The film starts by showing a dog digging in the ground in the desert. When the dog owner looked into the dug ground, inside were human skeletons. Not long after that, the police and a forensic team came to the location to dig in the area, and surprisingly, they found 11 rotten corpses, including the body of a pregnant woman. Seeing this, a police commander named Carter suspected that all the people buried there were victims of serial murder, but his two subordinates, Ortega and Young, could not conclude anything because of a lack of evidence. At the same time, police from another division were monitoring the drug dealer's hideout not far from the desert. The mission was led by a sergeant named Graham, and a newly transferred officer, Tate, was part of the team. When they arrived, they immediately raided it. After arresting the targets, they secured all the evidence, and then not long after, they saw news of a press conference held by Carter. They found out about the discovery of bodies in the desert because it happened that the desert was in the area. At the conference, Carter said that the police would work hard to uncover the mystery of the bodies. After the press conference, Carter told Ortega and Young to call a profiler from the FBI who would take part in the mission. A profiler is a profession whose job is to analyze a criminal case to get an overview of and characteristics of the criminal. When Ortega and Young arrived at the airport, they were both surprised by the FBI agent who was wearing casual clothes. He introduced himself as Agent Petrovic, and without much ado, he was taken to the office to discuss the case with Carter. Before starting a presentation, Petrovic said that he wanted to accept this case because he had previously investigated a very similar case. Apart from that, he also had personal reasons that he could not tell anyone. He concluded that all the evidence found by the police pointed to the serial murder case, in which he concluded that there was one psychopath who killed the victims over a period of 3 months. Plus, all the bodies found had something in common, namely that they were all prostitutes. He then showed a slide presentation explaining the kinds of serial killers. After the presentation, Petrovic narrowed down the suspects that the police had to look for, where according to the existing evidence, the suspect probably was not a local man and had an obsession with prostitutes. After the meeting, Ortega did not seem to believe Petrovic. Young was confused as to why her colleague was doubtful about Petrovic. It turned out that after reading the case file, she found out that one of the victims was Ortega's niece. The next day, Ortega and Young interrogated a former prostitute who had experienced a strange incident in 2001. From this interrogation, they found 2 suspects who matched the description by Petrovic. The first one was a Latin man with a big body and glasses, while the second surprised them both because he was a police officer, Tate from the drugs division. It turned out that Tate had been an undercover agent to arrest the top officials who ran the prostitution business, but because he often had problems, he was finally transferred to the anti-drugs division. After digging deeper, it turned out that Tate had once impregnated a prostitute, and what was surprising was that the woman was one of the victims found in the desert. Hearing this, Carter told Ortega to keep this information a secret while waiting for the results of the DNA test of the victims. Meanwhile, Petrovic was contemplating in his hotel, still looking for the perpetrator who had the heart to kill dozens of innocent women. It was revealed that the reason he accepted this case was to pay tribute to his late daughter, who was killed back in 2004 by a murderer who he had imprisoned. He managed to finish off the murderer, however, his daughter was shot in the chest and sadly had to lose her life. The next day, Ortega secretly dug up information without Young knowing. This time, he went to a prostitute named Candy who was a friend of Ortega's niece. But Candy didn't want to say anything because for her, all police were corrupt and not competent, so there was no point in telling Ortega. Not far from that place was a Latin man who kicked a prostitute from his car. Unfortunately, the man managed to escape from Ortega's pursuit. When the man arrived at his house, he immediately grumbled and acted like a person with mental illness. Then when it was late that night, he went to a convenience store to buy a drink. Strangely, he rubbed his hands with lotion before taking the drink from the cooler. Seeing that, the cashier looked a little suspicious of his movements. The cashier greeted the man by the name of Caesar. When he was about to pay for his drink, Caesar's focus was diverted to a beautiful girl who entered the store, and suddenly, he heard whispers to kill the woman. Before paying for his drink, he greeted the girl and offered to take her home. The girl was of course frightened and showed uncomfortable gestures. Feeling rejected, Caesar went to calm himself down in his car while the cashier warned the girl to be more careful because Caesar was a bit crazy. A few days later, Ortega got a call from Candy, who this time was willing to talk privately regarding the serial murder case. They met in a cafe and Candy began to tell the story of the beginning when Ortega's niece went missing. One night, she, Ortega's niece, and one of their friends held a drug party with the local men. When they returned from there, Ortega's niece got a message from a mysterious man who not long after that picked her up near the bar, but Candy and her friend didn't know was. Since that night, they never saw her again, and after further investigation, the man who picked him up might have been Tate. Unfortunately, Candy didn't know who killed Ortega's niece. Without wasting any more time, Ortega immediately gathered all the files about Tate and reported them to Carter and Petrovic. He discovered the fact that all the girls who had died had been once arrested by Tate, and according to him, Tate used them to satisfy his desires. They just needed to wait for the results of the DNA test to confirm again. But Petrovic didn't agree with Ortega's conclusion because he thought that the killer was a predator who was always stalking his prey while thinking about how to kill them, while Tate was a policeman who was busy with drug cartel cases every day, so it seemed impossible for him to have time to go out at night and kill the victims. Meanwhile, without the police knowing, the killer had killed another victim and buried her in the desert again. Carter had just received a call from his wife because he rarely came home. It was revealed that the reason he spent most of his time in the office was to atone for his sins in the past by thoroughly investigating this serial murder case, because it turned out that 3 years ago, he failed to save his colleague who died during a rescue mission in Mexico. The next day, Petrovic came with a colleague from the FBI who apparently had been investigating the serial murder case without Carter's knowledge, and based on the clues found by the agent, he concluded that Tate was not the murderer because he was an immigrant who just recently moved to the area, so his background did not match the existing evidence and clues. Of course, Ortega did not agree with the agent's opinion and urged Carter to remove them from the investigation. However, Carter actually believed them more. Meanwhile, Young was disappointed with Ortega, who kept all his investigation a secret from her. It was revealed that the reason Ortega didn't want to get Young involved was because she was a woman and she might become the next victim of the killer. Unfortunately, amidst the police investigation, the serial killer was still roaming freely and kept adding up more victims. Later, Ortega went to Estate Graham's office to talk to Tate. He warned Tate to be careful because he would be arrested sooner or later. Hearing that, Tate didn't understand why he was accused of being the murderer because he didn't know anything about the case. That night, Tate was contemplating alone in the nightclub while reminiscing about the incident last year when he picked up Ortega's niece. At that time, he was supposed to arrest the girl because she was caught committing a crime, but he promised to let her go as long as she wanted to sleep with him. After the meeting that night, he never saw her again, only to find a few months later that the girl was dead in the desert. After contemplating for quite a long time, Tate went to the toilet, but suddenly Graham beat him and warned him to be more careful in his actions. In essence, he told Tate to prove that he was not a murderer, and if he couldn't, then he would beat him harder because he had embarrassed his division. Meanwhile, Young secretly followed Ortega, who was visiting his sister's house. He tried to calm her, who was still sad after finding out that her daughter had died. He asked about his niece's friends who could be contacted to provide more clues to the case. His sister said that her daughter had been hanging out with a very suspicious gangster. Before Ortega left, she asked him to immediately find the perpetrator and punish him badly. That night, Petrovic and the FBI agents began to move to narrow down the list of the suspects so they could find the perpetrator more quickly. According to them, the police could no longer be relied on. At the same time, the killer was still freely targeting a prostitute to satisfy his desire to kill. He took the woman to a quiet place, finished her off, and then buried her. The next day, Ortega came to one of his niece's friends who was a suspicious gangster, and without further ado, he immediately asked the man about what happened that night when his niece was killed by a serial killer, but because the man didn't want to answer his question, Ortega immediately held him at gunpoint. When Ortega returned from the man's place, he read the case file. Young increasingly suspected that Ortega was hiding a lot of clues from her. Therefore, he invited Graham to carry out a separate investigation. In another place, Carter was calling someone. He promised the person on the phone that he would hide his crime as long as he didn't interfere with the police department. At the same time, the murderer ordered a prostitute to be killed, and it turned out the woman he ordered was Candy. He didn't suspect at all that the man in front of him was a murderer, and in the end, Candy had the same fate as Ortega's niece. On the other hand, Petrovic was seen interrogating the cashier who Caesar often visited. In this interrogation, the cashier told him all the strange things about Caesar, who looked like a psychopath. Caesar always came to the store, rubbed lotion on his hands, and took his favorite drink, and when a girl came in, he would scare her and ask to take her home. That day, state, Graham and his troops were carrying out a raid on a drug dealer's hideout, but he didn't take the dealer to prison and instead asked him for information circulating among criminals regarding serial murder that happened lately. He then reported all this information to Carter, where the information showed that Tate was the killer. With this information, he could become a hero for the city. This made Ortega upset because his duties were taken over by another division, but Carter already trusted Graham, so like it or not, Ortega was forced to obey him. After that, Tate was arrested and taken to the interrogation room. In the interrogation room, Tate didn't want to talk before his lawyer arrived. On the other hand, Carter told Ortega to look for additional evidence so that he could prove his accusations. Without thinking twice, Ortega immediately called Candy to ask her to be a witness in court. But of course, the woman didn't reply because she was dead. Shortly after, Carter got the results of a DNA test that the corpse that died while pregnant was not impregnated by Tate. With this result, Tate was freed of all the accusations. The next day, Petrovic held a meeting to inform Carter and his subordinates that the main suspect was Keyser. Firstly, he was a local man who lived near the burial site, and secondly, he was once arrested by the police for committing violence against women. According to confessions from local people, Keyser had a tendency of a psychopath, even though he regularly worships at church every week. According to Petrovic, Keyser had mental disorders and serious trauma, which made him develop strange habits such as killing. But again, Ortega doubts Petrovic's conclusion, even though Petrovic was clearly an expert profiler, whereas he was just an ordinary policeman. After holding a meeting, Petrovic's colleagues immediately called a prostitute who survived Caesar's cruelty. The woman told him about Caesar's behavior when using her service. He was shaking, and before they did their business, Keyser suddenly read verses from the Bible and attacked the woman. Luckily, the woman was saved by Tate and other police. Since this incident, Keyser was detained by the police for 6 months. At night, Keyser was trying to kill a prostitute in his house while Ortega, who was supposed to arrest the man, was instead following Tate. It seemed he was still convinced that Tate was the perpetrator, even though the FBI had explained that Tate was just an ordinary corrupt policeman. That night, Tate wanted to call a prostitute, but after realizing Ortega tailing him, he gave up his plans and tried to avoid Ortega. A chase happened between them, and Ortega managed to stop Tate's car. Because he was held at gunpoint, Tate finally wanted to open his mouth about the real incident. So at that time, he promised to release Ortega's niece from the law if she wanted to serve him. But after that, he dropped her off at the place where the prostitutes hung out because Ortega's niece wanted to meet his customer, who was none other than Keyser. While Ortega was busy with Tate, Petrovic and the other FBI agent were blocking Keyser, who was about to bury his victim's body, and in the end, the man was arrested. The next day, Ortega handed over the recording of his interrogation with Tate to Carter, and as expected, he didn't get any evidence because Tate wasn't the killer. Ortega then used the recording to arrest Graham, who turned out often violating the police code of ethics in order to catch the drug dealers. On the same day, Petrovic told Carter and Ortega that Keyser was a murderer, but he only killed a handful of victims, meaning the real serial killer was still out there. Hearing this, Ortega bragged and blamed all this on the FBI, but Petrovic said that if Ortega had obeyed from the start, the main perpetrator would have been caught. All of this happened because he always hampered the FBI's work with unnecessary things. Before leaving, Petrovic assured Ortega that he also wanted to catch the killer for the sake of honoring his daughter who had died. He wouldn't let any more victims fall, so he hoped that Ortega would cooperate and not be selfish. Day after day passed, and the government decided to close the case because it came to a dead end. Meanwhile, Petrovic was still investigating it secretly, and whatever happened, he would not allow the perpetrator to continue his actions. A month later, Ortega was seen visiting his sister for dinner, but he suddenly got a call from one of the policemen who shockingly found dozens of new victims from the serial murder case. Ortega was shocked. In the end, the police and the FBI failed to catch the real perpetrator, and since 2009, the killer no longer preys on his victims.